Hello, my name is Nicholas Geers, and this is my assignment for final research presentation. The project that I did with Lena that we focused on was the Edible Schoolyard Public School 216 in New York City, and that was done by Work Architecture Company. So Work Architecture Company is a firm out of New York. And they focus on combining the built environment and nature in more of an urban condition. They really like to bring the two together in all the projects that they do. Edible Schoolyard is a nonprofit that started in Berkeley, California, with the mission to bring food growth and production into schools and into education. So that's what this project is based on. The vision for Work AC was to create a building that made these connections between students and food and the environment, and also bring it into these low-income, underserved communities that currently have not as good relationships to food. Here's more about Edible Schoolyard's mission. Here are 4 things related to the research that and the readings that were done. And there are 4 different research rules. One is listen to the gentiles. So in this case, we thought of it as listening to what the students would need and their imagination. And then the second one's to question the question, and that's questioning how this type of project's actually done. 3 is dare to be silly, and we saw that as kind of not throwing out the silly ideas that relate to kids. And then 4 is to simplify, just make things not too complicated for kids. So the questions that we asked when approaching this research and then looking at the project was, how do you create an environment to teach and engage students? How can a building show sustainable and healthy ways of living? And how can a building be designed to house many different functions in such a small footprint? And the thesis is basically designing a building that made all these things happen. So this is analysis of how Work AC catered their design to kids, and I'll be going over this more in the future, but some little highlights are just that they did use bright colors and fun designs to create a kid-friendly space. The next thing that we looked at was multi-use spaces. So it's a very simple layout with 3 different spaces, but each space serves a couple different functions. So the takeaway from this initial analysis of the project was that they created a successful kid-friendly learning environment that allowed students to learn hands-on about growing and making food, and the facility teaches kids an importance on living sustainably, and hopefully can influence them to bring this knowledge into their families and communities. And here are other discourses that we kind of continuing on a lot of the same ideas that we kept going with, was how to design these spaces, how to influence the people to live sustainable lives, and how to give them sustainable habits, and how we can use that to spread it to their communities. So here's our initial research thesis. In order to teach building users how to live sustainably and create good habits, we can design buildings that integrate natural environments and use sustainable methods to complete daily tasks, and then that the project can be a model for other schools and educational facilities. In the second presentation, we look at the methods that they used or in depth. The kind of hypothesis that AC worked with is creating spaces that are functional, easy to understand, and fun. Here shows their kind of formula. So it's functional spaces, easy to understand, and fun, while also connecting to nature and sustainable design. Functional design is important. So this goes back to, again, they did 3 very easy spaces. Each function is very easy to understand and serves its specific purpose, specifically the systems wall, which I'll talk about more in a minute. System wall is important for the ease to understand. It specifically shows students different sustainable things that they can incorporate in making and growing food. So the things in the systems wall include a tool shed, rainwater collection, making these things all apparent to kids so they can see the whole process. Another way they used easy to understand design was they designed the kitchen to use domestic scale everything, so that kids could more easily take what they learned back to their own kitchens. And then fun design response, they did a lot with this. They use uses a lot of bright colors when they're designing for kids. They believe that kids respond more to things like this, and it makes it a more fun environment for them to be in. So they use a lot of bright colors inside and outside of this building, as well as those funky round windows and skylights, to make it feel a little bit less like a classroom. And I think kids take more away when they are having fun. This is some stuff that Lena worked with. I'm not going to touch on this as much because there's a lot of reading there. Again, kind of going over the points of interest and goals, visions. Lots of readings on the solutions and findings. And then for the final portion, it was more focused on context. So we focused on site context that include open space and existing food infrastructure, economic factors, more related to funding and I guess how the project was created on a smaller budget, and then behaviors, how the project seeks to change behaviors of the students. So the initial site analysis in looking at Brooklyn, which is the neighborhood around the school, was that there's very little public infrastructure for kids. It's a very densely populated area with very little green space, and other urban farms are not really around, and it's an area of high obesity and I guess just bad relationships with food. So the project itself created a better site context. The new green infrastructure helps to feed and provide food for school lunches. It creates a nice new community space that brings together nonprofits, volunteers, students, teachers, and community members. And then it also just provides a space and opportunity for kids to stay involved in and out of school. They had a lot of after-school programs that kept students involved. Project funding for the economic factor, it was a lot of private funding, but it was also a lot of public funding from the New York school system. They are a nonprofit, so they get a lot of grants and private donations. So in that sense, it's a pretty relying on the community kind of program for as far as money is concerned. Food relationships to change behaviors. The adult schoolyard allows the students to learn from an early age and keep going on about new healthier habits. It helps them learn a sense of responsibility and ownership because they have to maintain and work hard in the gardens even outside of school and not necessarily just in it during the classes. And then the kids' behaviors from learning this sense of responsibility and ownership and from learning these healthy habits will pass it on to their communities and neighborhoods. And the communities and neighborhoods also have a place to come and learn more themselves. So even if it's not passed along, they learn from being around it. So moving to Detroit, there's already 21 active edible schoolyard programs in place or in progress. That includes gardens and other organizations that help with schools. So comparing Detroit to Brooklyn, Detroit has a lot of opportunity to make more of these programs possible. They have a lot of open space and green infrastructure in place. There's also a lot of nonprofits that work already in the city to work on urban gardens and farms. So there's a lot of good infrastructure there. Some of the negatives is that there is a high amount of obesity and underserved children, so there's a great need for it, which is negative and positive for the project itself. And then another negative is that the public school infrastructure and funding is not real great, so it would rely heavily on nonprofits and private funding. And that is it.